right, so Dr. Nick, we've spoken about some great things, and we talked about purpose, we've talked about meaning, we've talked faith, hope, and trust, and putting all this together. One of the things that was very helpful, and I'm very grateful that back several years ago, when we were having our conversations, which I've been very fortunate to be blessed to have known you for quite a long time now and learned so much. But what you turned me on to was Viktor Frankl and his book, Man's Search for Meaning. And I remember those days. I was in some pretty dark days, and just trying to understand not only why, and you look back on these things, it's interesting. A lot of these moments when you're at your worst and your weakest, you're actually, it's really when you're at your strongest, which is, a very interesting phenomenon, because you are, and I think you've talked about this, if we search and we try to really understand what's going on, and just asking that question, why am I in this place? But not to look at it from a from the standpoint of feel self-loathing or whatever, but looking at it as an opportunity to grow, which thankfully, you helped me do. The book in Viktor Frankl's work, and how he, which I was really intrigued by, how he spoke about the experience that he had in Auschwitz and the horrible experience that he, along with others, during that time, which is still really, it's really incomprehensible to a certain extent that humans could treat other humans the way in which they did. But I think looking at it from the perspective of what he learned from that, and how he helped people within, even at the time at the concentration camp, and how he went on to help so many people, was a great example of someone taking the absolute worst of circumstances and turning it into something really good and really powerful. But I think that the biggest thing that I was left with, and I remember when again being in this dark time, and now reading through the eyes of what he was going through, was, here's this guy who was in the absolute worst circumstances, just awful what he was surrounded with. But there was a moment where he was out there, and here was a guy who was very introspective to begin with, and you could tell that from even the way he wrote. But here he's digging that ditch, and that was their job every day, was to go out there and dig ditches. And during that chore, he has this, he's staring over, he sees the tree, sees this barn, and he starts to have this like spiritual experience where he envisions and has this episode where he's seeing his wife, and he has this experience, and he feels something inside him, right? Like there's something that's going on inside him while he's having this experience. And it was what I love about that. It was he had reaffirmation when all of a sudden this beautiful bird lands on top of the dirt that he was shoveling in it, and it was this recognition of, for him, that I can choose to see what I want to see through this, and I can choose to experience, and I'll talk to my wife. I could talk to my wife, and I can find a way through this by choosing my attitude. And I think the saying that's on the screen was incredible, but it's hard. I remember when I read that, I still sat there. I said, could I do that? I mean, in the most dire circumstances, would I have that inner strength to do that? And unfortunately, some chose not to. But that's what his whole thing was, right? Was that one can choose their way. So if I can hand it off to you, and you speak a little bit about that.
Well, the whole process of choice, I think, is sometimes we forget And, as we've talked before about, what purpose is, that you're doing something and you might not recognize that you have the opportunity to do it in a different way. So if we look at some things that are pleasurable, like sports, playing golf, you may say you're going to go out and you're going to shoot your lowest score.
Right.
But if you're not driven by the purpose of being focused, being relaxed, being mindful, you cannot perform at your highest level. So choice is always available to us. We have to recognize how many choices that we have. That's why it's important to understand we can use our curiosity and our discovery to find out more about the potentials, about how we can choose to live our lives and function optimally.
Yeah, that's great. And I thought this was a great way also to, end our conversation today that we're having. It's really interesting when this hit me, and I think it's so appropriate for the time in which we're living in right now. And I think when you really look at this, how it's very true, right? And I think there are, unfortunately, so many news channels and media outlets that thrive and unfortunately making a hell of a lot of money on provoking fear, and how you see it, right? So you see that fear completely binds people together, but it disperses them, right? It divides. And it's very true. But how courage, right? Courage inspires. And so when you think about the medical workers right now, you think about like frontline workers of all different sorts, right? So everyone that's out there risking and sacrificing, and some they're all different levels of sacrifice, but they're all sacrifice. And some unfortunately have to sacrifice their entire well-being and that of their families because they need to meet the basic needs, right? Those Maslow hierarchy of needs. So some of which we look at in terms of people having courage. It's courage to meet the basic level of needs. And it's also having courage to meet higher levels of needs. That someone has a desire to do so much good beyond oneself. And they're all doing that, just meeting in terms of different ways of needs for others is really what it comes down to. But how that is used, and you can see it and you can feel it, right? So when you look at and how important this is for us to all recognize is just look at what the way you feel or interpret when you see every day at a certain hour, you have New York City applauding the medical workers, and that there's something inside of us that's reassuring, right? That we can't explain, but man, does that feel good, and man, do you feel part of something bigger than yourself. And then you put yourself in that situation, and then you think about how you feel when you first started understanding more about how contagious or deadly the COVID-19 may be. And those are all things we need to be aware of. Don't get me wrong. I think you've always used this, that, yeah, you need to understand. And we have a very internal sense of understanding that a fire is very dangerous. And that if we're in a room and the place is on fire, we should run and get out of the fire, right? But if we're sitting in a room like we're in right now and there is no fire, and we envision having a fire in our room and we feel that level of fear, that's irrational, right? And we're doing it on our own. We're bringing that fear into us, right?
Right.
I think so. I just wanted to get your commentary around that, and wrapping everything up that we talked about today, and how this is a choice that we all have to make.
Well, let's put together a couple of pieces here. First of all, I'm drawn to the term community. So courage inspires communities, and I'm looking at this in a context not just of American society and how we're facing, the COVID. I'm looking at this as we relate it to either our family or even to the workforce. So what is it that influences others? So when you look at group functioning frequently is affected by someone who is a leader,
Yeah.
right? So when the inspiration is occurring, it's a result of someone who's taken the courage, who's modeled that, and has alerted other people that that might be at rest within you and that you hadn't even discovered. And that as a result of that, the whole group starts to function in a way differently.
Yeah.
We can look at that in terms of leadership. So the person who is the inspiration, in a corporation, whatever the job site might be, has the ability to influence the community as long as the community is open-minded to this. And we get back to what happens with individuals. But I'm drawn to this whole idea about his talking about courage being inspiring. And I think that the inspiration comes because someone has taken the risk to do things that other people might not have. People didn't even know that existed. That person might not have even known that they had the courage. This
Right.
goes back to the whole discovery and purpose.
Yes.
Sometimes we're not even drawn into what our purpose is until we're facing adversity.
Right. And with that, and to kind of use it as a conclusion, what do you say? How would you describe that? How would you describe that experience that here it is that you never thought maybe you had that strength, right? Because if you step back and probably would have looked at some of the ways in which people are putting themselves in such dangerous positions on the behalf of others, if they, to some degree, they probably would think, "Oh, I would never do that," or that would, that's something I don't think, "Oh, if I can ever overcome that." But it's interesting how they find a way, right? And where does that come from?
Well, I can't be specific about all of what goes on in the brain, but there are clear examples that when a person is faced with adversity, something actually gets generated in the brain that you don't experience at any other time. People can lift up a car and get someone out from under the car.
Yeah.
And they would never have been able to do that except when the brain is triggered, by some event. So I do think that some of this stuff has a physiological basis to it, and people don't even know that they've done it until after it's over. And there's
Right.
an altered state of consciousness, so I think that there are factors that go along that way. If we tie it back into this whole courageous piece, when a person doesn't even know, that I do think that that's actually based upon some belief at a level, and maybe it's more kind of an inherent quality, but I do think it uh, goes way beyond, it's transcendent. Um, if the purpose is to make sure you're saving your family, that might not be a hard one for you to make the decision. If you're doing it to save people that you don't know, I think it's a very different process. But I
Hmm.
do think it is generated in what I would describe as a spirit, and I would also describe it as a belief, and it is in the essence of the person.
Yeah. And with that, I think it also goes to show you that, and you talked about this when we do it for face adversity and we face challenging times, that we have potential that we didn't even realize. And I think that's, well, again, a key that we're really faced with, and trying to help one another with this concept that our understanding and a greater awareness of what the human experience is like will help us not limit what our potentials can be. So thank you so much, Dr. Nick.
Thank you, Paul.
Always fascinating and uplifting at the same time. So thank
Thank you
you
very
for
much.
your time today.